The A says, the A says, every letter makes a sound. The A says, and the B says, the B says, every letter makes a sound. The B says, the C says, the C says, every letter makes a sound. The C says, the D says, the D says, every letter makes a sound. The D says, the E says, the E says, every letter makes a sound. The E says, the F says, the F says, every letter makes a sound. The F says, the G says, the G says, every letter makes a sound. The G says, the H says, the H says, every letter makes a sound. The H says, the I says, the I says, every letter makes a sound. The I says, the J says, the J says, every letter makes a sound. The J says, K. The K says, the K says, every letter makes a sound. The K says,
L.
The L says, the L says, every letter makes a sound. The L says,
O.
the M says, the M says, every letter makes a sound. The M says, the N says, the N says, every letter makes a sound. The N says, but the O says, the O says, every letter makes a sound. The O says, the P says, the P says, every letter makes a sound. The P says, now let's review. The Q says, the Q says, every letter makes a sound. The Q says, the R says, the R says, every letter makes a sound. The R says, the S says, the S says, every letter makes a sound. The S says, the T says, the T says, every letter makes a sound. The T says, the U says, the U says, every letter makes a sound. The U says, the V says, the V says, every letter makes a sound. The V says, W.
When I play it over here, the room, it starts to shake. In my ear, what I found, it's the sound that you make.
Wow! This learning letter stuff is fun. Thanks.
You are welcome, don't you know?
It's time for us to go.
This lesson, it is through.
What is the sound of it? W.
The X says, the X says, every letter makes a sound. The X says, the Y says, the Y says, every letter makes a sound. The Y says, Lullaby, z, z, z. Catch some Z's when day is done. Zzz is your sound. Now go to sleep, my little one. Zzz, zzz, zzz.